It's pretty fluffy. I'm personally cynical. We've got a government at the moment that's taxing a whole heap more, about 17 billion more over the next 4 years. They're wasting money all over the place, and I just don't see how a bunch of actually 100 fluffy wellbeing indicators is going to help them make lives for New Zealanders better.
Well, Grant Robertson joins me now in the Auckland studio. We'll get to... Good morning.
Good morning.
We'll get to the fluffy indicators a bit later. Let's do the numbers first, sure, and then the wellbeing stuff after that. You've got... OK, so the surplus isn't looking as good as it might have immediately, but it balloons out to a pretty massive number. By 2022, you're projected to have $8 billion as a surplus. You're flush with cash.
Oh, I don't know if we're flush with cash, but the books are still solid. I mean, what those numbers mean is that the economy is continuing to grow. We've got a lot of calls on that money. We need to keep our debt levels under control because as a small country susceptible to whatever might happen in the world, and we're certainly seeing plenty of things happen in the world, we've got to be able to be resilient to that. And we've got infrastructure that we want to invest in. We've got programs we want to invest in. So that is a sign that the economy is ticking along, and that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. You've got 100,000 children in poverty. We had the Children's Commissioner this week said things are no better, no worse either, that we've dropped the ball on this. He said, and to quote him, "However you cut it, there are effectively 2 Eden Parks full of children who are doing it really tough." About 100,000, he said. How can you post and bank a surplus of $8 billion and leave 100,000 children in poverty?
Well, that's why one of the main priorities I announced yesterday was lifting children out of poverty and improving child wellbeing. The first thing we did as a government was to reverse the tax cuts of the previous government and put that money into families so that children can be lifted out of poverty.
Yeah, but
we're going to improve their wellbeing. So we're going to keep doing that, is my point, Guy, and that the surplus is, and then let's be fair, that's not $8 billion I've got in the bank today. That's a projected surplus in 4 or 5 years' time. We are prioritising lifting children out of poverty.
Why don't you do more about it, though? How can you leave 100,000 children in poverty while you would bank a surplus that big? And you either believe the numbers or you don't.
I believe the numbers, but I believe them as good a forecast as we're going to get. But that's not money we've got today. We're talking about 4 years' time. What we're saying is we are prioritising reducing the number of children in poverty. We've got a bill going through Parliament that will oblige me as the Minister of Finance to stand up at every budget and say what I've done to reduce the number of children in poverty and report on where those numbers are at. So this is a big job, but it is one of our top priorities to address.
Let's look at another measure. You've got 9,000 eligible families on the waiting list for public housing. That's up a third on that figure at the end of last year. And yet you're posting a debt to GDP ratio of under 20%. Can you explain to, let's say, a woman with a number of children waiting for emergency housing in New Zealand, why it's more important for you to have debt at under 20% of GDP than it is for her to have a house?
I'm not saying it's more important. It's about striking the balance between making sure we invest now to build houses, and we've said we're going to build around 1,600 more social houses.
Over 4 years.
We're putting millions. Yep,
it's over 4 years, and you've got a waiting list of 9,000 families. That's greymouth.
If you let me finish, and also putting in place transitional housing and significant amount of money going into emergency and transitional housing for people just like the situation you've described. But the balance is we've also got to look out for future generations. It's no different to anybody else, Guy, in their household budgeting, that they actually have to be able...
I'm talking about someone without a household at all. You've got greymouth. It's the population of greymouth waiting for housing, and yet you're looking at these surpluses into the billions and billions of dollars. You've got debt at a ridiculously low level of GDP, and great. That's good in terms of the books, but how is it more important than people? You're talking about a well-being budget. It can't get much worse for well-being than not having a house.
And what I'm saying is that we want to make sure that we're investing the money in the right places. That's why we've got priorities that are about addressing the people who are on the lowest incomes and improving their opportunities. We've got to make sure that we plan for the long term, that we invest and we get the balance right. We are putting significantly more resources into housing, and we're focusing that through the priorities in this budget in the areas where it's needed the most.
What will this well-being budget really mean?
It means that we're not going to measure our success anymore just on the basis of GDP growth. It's actually the very point that you've been making in this interview. We've had really good rates of GDP growth over the last few years, but at the same time, things have got worse in terms of homelessness or child poverty or mental health services. What we're now going to do is measure our success across all of those areas, making sure that we're looking out for how our people are, our environment is, and how our communities are. But Guy, here's the really important point. We're not just doing that in how we judge our success. We're using that same framework to decide what we invest in. So all of the ministers in government are now responsible for making sure that we actually address some of those big issues.
I read through your statement this morning, and you hear a lot of the rhetoric after 9 years of neglect of national, and you've been pushing that line out. I read this report, and it says, in terms of wellbeing, the wellbeing outlook that's existing now, quote, New Zealanders have high levels of well-being, socially connected, well-governed, clean environment, healthy, well-educated population with increasing standards of living. Life expectancy is increasing, and some 85% or more of New Zealanders report good or very good health. Is that the 9 years of neglect you've been talking about?
New Zealand is a relatively prosperous country compared to the rest of the world. What you've left out is the stuff that comes after that in that very same outlook, which says far too many people have been missing out on the benefits of the fact that New Zealand is a relatively well-off country. That's what we've done in this process, is we've gone and looked at the evidence where those disparities exist, and they are the areas we're now prioritising.
I just wonder, though, that whether this is a fig leaf for neoliberalism, really. You've locked yourself in to your 20% debt target, to your Crown core spending at 30% of GDP. You're banking massive surpluses, and then you say, "Oh, but it's a well-meaning, what is it? A living well budget?" Or what does that actually mean if you've already locked yourself into that paradigm of effectively conservative economics?
No, it's not. I mean, I totally reject that label. You can't apply that label when we came in and we reversed a set of tax cuts. You can't apply that label when we've passed laws that make it much fairer for workers in the workplace. You can't apply that label when we're investing record amounts in health and education, where we're intervening in the housing market to make sure that there are homes for first home buyers. This is a progressive government that's investing heavily in the areas that matter, and at the same time looking out for future generations in terms of how we run the economy.
Right. Hey,
it's about balance, Guy, and I think we've got the balance right.
Just finally, since you're here, and we've been running this story this morning, so let's get your reaction to it. The accusation, I think you heard some of it while you were waiting to do this interview, from the Midwives Union. Jill Ovens was speaking to us before, basically claims that you, and names you, and other ministers somehow interfered with the pay negotiations with the District Health Board, somehow vetoed a proposal that was put forward. What's your response to those allegations?
Well, the meeting that's alleged to have happened just didn't take place. So I don't know where Jill got that information from, but it's simply not true. The negotiations are underway between DHBs and midwives. The parameters for those negotiations have been set, and obviously ministers are involved in setting the parameters, but the actual negotiations are taking place, and it's up to the DHBs and the Midwives Union to look at how they want to organise that package, but I don't have any direct involvement in that.
Thanks very much for your time and for coming in this morning. Do really appreciate that.
Cheers.
That is Grant Robertson, who of course is the Finance Minister. Let us know your views on that one. I'm sure there'll be plenty. 2101 on the text. Morning Report at radionz.co.nz on email, and we're NZ Morning Report on